Welcome back for the second part of this video series for integrating Intune with ClearPass. Just for a small recap, we have configured the extension and now we are actually going to onboard our Windows device into Intune and create the ClearPass policies in order to perform wireless authentication with Intune. So without further ado, we'll head over to a clean Windows 10 device. I'll minimize that screen, go to Windows 10, and I'll open up the certificate user and computer store just to show you that this is a clean device. Hit on OK, and sure enough, here you don't see any certificates. So it's time to make a change for that. I'll save this view for later references. Call this certificate. And I will open up the settings menu where we will onboard our device into Intune. So clicking on accounts and then work or access or school. There are basically two ways that you can onboard your device into Intune, either through only device management or by linking it with the Azure Active Directory. And the Azure Active Directory means that this won't be a personal device and that you can, for example, push PowerShell scripts. This is something that we'll do later on in this video series, but for now we'll only do the enrollment into mobile device management. So over here you have the option to select join this device into the Azure Active Directory. So clicking on only device management, log in with my Azure AD credentials. And as soon as I'm authenticated, the configuration policies that I've set will be deployed to this particular machine. I may reboot a while for example, the certificates to fully load. So just refreshing this screen, at some point you would already see a certificate has been pushed by Intune. And this is not a certificate that we can use for wireless or wired authentication on your network since we do not hold a private key, but it does, or it is used for identification for this particular computer by Intune. So I'll just close this for a second. And the machine will set itself up. Just to give you some more ideas about how the certificates are being deployed to an Intune device, I'll head over to the Microsoft Help article, which explains the different types of certificates that you can use for authentication, so PKCS or PFX. But for this video series, I'll be using SCAP, since I have my own RootCA, which will be providing the certificates for the user devices. And here are the different options laid out if you, for example, use a SCAP versus a PFX. So scrolling to the bottom of the page, there is an additional resource called Third-Party Certificate and Certification Authority. And this page roughly describes the process of a SCAP certificate, how that is issued with a certificate signing request, and at some point a CSR being relayed to the SCAP server, and at some point a certificate issued by your RootCA to the particular Intune device. Of course, this can be your own Active Directory certificate services, but this can also be a third-party certificate authority. And there's a list of those over here. I am using Scapman, a community edition, which is free. It's easy to set up since it uses solely Azure resources. So going to the Scapman page, you might get a better idea of the process that a certificate is requested and at some point is issued, and the keys are installed in the Azure Key Vault database. So this is the part of Scapman, and setting that up is obviously not a part of this video series, but I do want to show you the configuration that I've done in order for the devices to receive its certificates in Intune configuration policies. So going to the device configuration and then profiles. You see over here the configuration profiles for a SCAP-cert machine and a user. And they're roughly the same. And the only difference is the certificate type. But if I go to the properties and then the settings, you would see that certificate type is for a user. It uses an email address as a subject name. It is used for client authentication, and this one is important, the SCAP server URL, because the client will reach out to this URL to request for a certificate. So the same goes for the machine certificate. Going to properties and then settings. Over here you'll see the same as well as the server URL. So going back to the machine, if I click on info and then hit the sync button, we'll try to sync every certificate. I'll also restart the computer just to make sure that we get the user and the computer certificate as well. So now that the machine has rebooted, I'll head over to the certificate store again. And sure enough, we see a certificate beside the certificate that we saw earlier, the certificate issued by the Intune CA. We also see a certificate for this particular user. The device RootCA is SCAPman, so the configuration of the policy has gone well for the Intune side, for the user, and also the user certificate store. Sure enough, we have a computer certificate that is as well issued by our RootCA. So that has gone splendid. Now it's time to actually use those certificates for our network authentication. Of course, this is something that you would normally do in Intune, but just to show you the process and which knobs to configure, I'll just do it manually now. So we are going to connect to the Airheads corporate network by going to Network and Internet Settings. Scrolling down to Network and Sharing Center and setting up a new connection or network to a wireless network. So the name is Airheads Corp, that's the ESID. We want to use WPA2 Enterprise Authentication and start the connection automatically. And there are a few changes that we need to make, such as instead of username password, we want to use certificate. We only want to connect to the ClearPass.stbranch.nl. That's the radio server. And its certificate has been issued by the Let's Encrypt RootCA. And for the certificate selection, we select the SCAPman RootCA. Click on OK, and now we'll select computer authentication for now. So we'll authenticate with our certificate in the computer certificate store. Click on OK, and by now, if I click on Airheads Corp Connect, we see it trying to connect. Going back to the ClearPass Policy Manager, we should see an authentication request coming in. Then to the access tracker, and sure enough, we see our authentication request coming in. And since this is a clean server, we still need to do some configuration in order to make this work. So I'll go to the configuration side and we will create a new authentication method specifically for Intune TLS computer authentication. We'll call this Intune TLS computer. And select EAP-TLS method. The only change that we're gonna make for this authentication method is untick the authorization required. And the reason for that is that normally with authorization required, you will be mapping the username to an authentication source. Since we're only using the Intune extension for now, which uses a MAC address, the username is obviously not going to match. So we are going to use different types of attributes in order to be sure that we're letting on a valid corporate computer, which has a valid certificate issued by our Scapman RootCA, and that is actually present in the Azure device registry. So click Save for now, and now Services. We'll call this the 802.1x Aruba service. So Airheads Corp Intune computer. And we'll select authorization since we will add the Intune extension as an authorization source. For the ESS ID, instead of the operator exists, it should equal to Airheads Corp. And we'll go to Authentication. We'll remove the methods that are present now. And we'll select Intune TLS computer. At this particular point, it doesn't really matter what the authentication source is because authorization is unticked. So I'll just add the Endpoint Repository. And for the authorization, it's important to add the Intune source. We'll make a new role mapping policy where the default role should be Other. And we'll call this the Airheads Corp. Right, so now it's time to make some rule mappings where we'll state that if the device is present in the Intune device registry, we want to allow it and we'll give it the employee role. So we'll filter on the Microsoft Intune authorization source. And if you click on this drop-down button, you'll see the different types of attributes. Here I'll just state that if a device Azure device ID exists, we are good to go. Click on Save and add it to the service. For the enforcement policy, I'll just do the same. I'll make a new enforcement policy where the default profile should be a deny if nothing matches. We'll call this the Airheads Corp enforcement policy. And the rule should be if the role equals an employee, we want to allow it on the network. All right, let's save this enforcement policy and add it to the service. Click on Save. And by now we have a new service. Let's try to reconnect to the network. If we go back to monitoring, we should see something different. We should see that it's actually hitting this authentication request, actually hitting a service. So sure enough, we're hitting a service, but we're still receiving a reject. Let's see what's happening. So I did get the role employee, so that's good. But the server is saying unknown CA. And this is logical because we haven't added the Scapman RootCA in our trust list yet. So what I'll do is I'll go to administration and then trust list. And we will add the RootCA of the certificates to ClearPass. So I'll minimize this for a second. Click on the certificate, certification path, and then view the RootCA. And I'm just gonna copy this particular file to the desktop. All right, so now that we've exported this particular certificate, I'm just gonna paste it into my downloads folder, right, and add it. just gonna drag and drop it. And the usage should be for EAP. So now that we've whitelisted this particular RootCA, let's go back to the access tracker again and try to re-authenticate. Alright, and sure enough, we're connected to the network. If we go to the access tracker, we see an accept coming in. We have a machine authenticator role and the employee role, which means that we match the configuration that we did so far. So in the radius request, we see some information and the authorization attributes. That's what we want, right? Because the device ID must exist, which is really important. So this means that we fetch the information from the Intune API and use that for our policies. But in order to make it even more secure, not only to allow users from the Intune, if they exist in the device registry, we also want to make a check, for example, that they try to authenticate with a certificate that we issued them. So I'll copy this value. The distinguished name of the certificate RootCA is this one. I'll just close this and go to configuration. I'll go back to the role mapping policy and modify the existing one. Click on edit. And since I'm adding a different rule line, I want to match all the conditions. So here we can filter on a certificate that the issuer distinguished name should equal to the one of Scapman. So make sure that you don't have any typos or spaces in between. Click on save now. And we should be good to go. We'll just reconnect for a second. And in the monitoring and the X tracker, we should see the authentication request popping up. So sure enough, this is the authentication request. And in order to make sure that we hit it the right configuration, just click on show config and then role mapping policy details. You would see the configuration that was effective when this authentication request happened. So sure enough, we see that we were authenticated in the with the employee role. That was because the device existed in the Azure device registration, but also because it authenticated with the certificate that was issued by Scapman. All right, so that's a wrap. The second video about configuring the Intune machines, enrolling them into the network, and how to use the certificate that have been provided to these computers and make ClearPass policies to actually authenticate these devices, making sure that only those devices that have been issued an Intune certificate and are actually registered in the Intune database are allowed on the network. So that concludes this video. We will continue with the next video with integrating Azure AD in the equation of Intune. And we will also include user authentication with that as well. Thank you for watching.